Hi everyone, $15 minimum wage here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new Oneohtrix Point Never album, Age of. This is the latest full-length album from electronic and experimental music producer Daniel Lopatin, aka Oneohtrix Point Never. A guy who thus far has had one of the most versatile careers of any artist cut from his cloth, covering the bases of drone and progressive electronic music, ambient, post-industrial, glitch, plunderphonics, and that's just under the Oneohtrix Point Never name. We're not even getting into his electronic improvisational stuff or his vaporwave material. Recently, under the OPN name, Daniel has dropped some pretty cutting-edge music. Replica, Garden of Delete, R+7, the last of which there is maybe my least favorite of the three, but I see why the fans love it. He's pretty much been on a streak lately, so there's really no reason not to go into this new album over here excited, especially with this incredibly odd album cover. There was also a lead single from this album titled Black Snow, which didn't blow me away, but nevertheless I found intriguing. It was a really strange mix of MIDI music and new age and art pop, featured a kind of rare lead vocal, very naked lead vocal from Daniel himself. And as to be expected because of this track, but also because Daniel tends to reinvent himself with each new release, he does break at least a little new ground for himself on this record, as some of the songs on this thing feature some pretty prominent lead vocals, as well as, like I said, the whole new age thing. Some classical undertones get worked in occasionally as well, especially on the incredibly gorgeous and regal introductory track. But overall, a lot of the tracks on this thing kind of make me think this is music that I would hear if I were to attend like a cult meeting for a particular cult whose message was super futuristic and utopian, as a lot of the compositions and instrumentation on this thing has a very synthetic, glossy, and idyllic vibe, which Daniel occasionally undercuts with some weird compositional twists and turns, or warped instrumentation or distortion glitches, intentionally messing with some of the images of perfection and sanitation that I think a lot of the music on this record brings. And I like that characteristic. I think it's a cool idea. However, I fail to see Daniel following all the way through with it from beginning to end on this album. Truth be told, I think this is one of his most inconsistent albums in a while. Not only that, but some of the ideas on this thing sort of sound like an idealistic and occult take on some of the sounds that he had drummed up on his previous record, Garden of Delete, which The Station is kind of a prime example of. The plucky and hypnotic MIDI guitars on this track are pretty refreshing, but the heavily processed lead vocals on this track sound like, again, something that could have been on Garden of Delete. The compositional style is eerily familiar as well, and then there's that weird instrumental shift in the back end of this track that features some melting synth layers that could have been worked into his last major release in the ambient genre, Returnal. But that's the other thing with this record. More than any other OPN album in recent memory, this is very much an everything but the kitchen sink album. Because you have moments on this thing like Babylon, which is a painfully awkward futuristic art pop track with downright dreadful and boring lead vocals encased in these way too washed out synths. This exists on the same album as the dark industrial and percussive Will Take It. And it's not like the flow from one track to the next between these two songs is that logical either. This album is littered with 1-minute detours, vocal appearances from the likes of Anohni and Prurient, which, while they're good, they do kind of inadvertently add to the lack of cohesion among these tracks. I mean, there's futuristic pop on this thing, apocalyptic post-industrial, moody MIDI jazz, all of which kind of break up the vaguely new age aesthetic that quite a few tracks on this thing bring. I mean, there are highlights on here, but I just failed to see how it all ties together. The tracks on this thing feel even more disconnected from one another than the material on Replica, which is crazy considering just how wide and varied the source material Daniel sampled on that record was. I also think R+7 is a more cohesive record too, despite the point of that album being to create these separate sonic objects with each song. At least all the tracks on that album shared a similarly abstract aesthetic. Age of doesn't seem to have much of a clear progression or focal point. It's more like potpourri, and as a result, even though there are good tracks on this release, they don't really build on one another all that well. Still, I do enjoy tracks on this thing, such as Toys 2, which features this strangely beautiful and inspiring lead synth melody whose timbre is a lot like that of, I don't know, an alien reed instrument. All of these are being supported by these epic and ascending keyboard arpeggios and glitchy percussion. It sounds like a piece of music from a movie score war where humans are embroiled in an ongoing war with like an alien species, and one person breaks from the culture of hate to reach across enemy lines and befriend the aliens and understand their culture and realize that they're just sentient beings with wants and desires and needs, much like ourselves. Directed by James Cameron. Eventually, the music on this track shifts into the kind of disjointed synthscapes that I loved so much on Daniel's Replica record, but with a softer and more futuristic edge. I also enjoy the song Warning quite a bit too, which has these tense, eerie staccato synthesizers. Eventually, the tension of these synths builds up into a really abrasive vocal appearance from Dominic Furnau, aka Prurient. The track is short but unsettling and twisted. The song Same, featuring some vocals from Oneohtrix, has some absolutely insane vocal layering. It's the kind of sampling and twisted sound play I typically expect out of like an Orange Milk Records release, but the instrumental density of this track is almost like on an orchestral level. Not only that, but the song is kind of finished off with this high gloss new age finish. There are some abrasive shots of noise in the mix too, as well as psychedelic delays. This track for me is like peak cult vibes on the album. It's like listening to a religious chant. I also love the song RAYCATS, which is this incredibly gorgeous and complex MIDI string piece. It is a wonderfully dynamic and sprawling piece, which I think goes to show just how much Daniel's sound design abilities have advanced in the past 5 years. It's just unfortunate that he's showcasing this talent on one of his least consistent albums in a while. The song Still Stuff That Doesn't Happen also features Oneohtrix, and sounds like a moody mix of MIDI electronics, art pop, and jazz, all set in the waiting room for Purgatory in the year 3000. And then the closing track, the last known image of a song, really lives up to its title in that it feels like more of an impression of a song than an actual song. It feels almost like Daniel is taking a Replica-esque approach to this track in that he may be composing a song and then chopping that track up, sampling it, and then putting like a new age jazz finish on it. Personally, I think there are a lot of interesting highlights on this album. The sounds on this thing are vivid, luscious, gorgeous. It's like abstract ear candy at its highest points. I think Daniel's soundcraft and composition efforts, for the most part, are pretty good on here too. But I still can't help but feel like the overall lack of focus, cohesion, as well as some of the more vocal-led tracks on this thing going over like gangbusters, these things are really kind of holding Age of back from its true potential. I'm feeling a strong 6 to a light 7 on this thing. Transition, have you given Age of a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like, please subscribe, and please don't cry. Over here next to my head is another video that you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Oneohtrix Point Never, forever.